Good afternoon. My name is Arvise Washington, and I am the Deputy Director for the Department of Navy's Office of Small Business Programs. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our webinar series where we will be hosting a series of webinars on various topics throughout the summer. I would like to direct you to our website at secnav.navy.mil/small-business, where you can find a wealth of information, including our DON OSBP operations plan. You can locate your local small business professional and find information on how to do business with the DON, including our long-range acquisition forecast. To learn more about our upcoming events and to register, please follow us on social media on our various platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We have a series of upcoming webinars. One this week on Thursday, Mr. Chris Espenshaw from NAVSUP will be featuring an introduction to NAVSUP and how it's protecting the Navy supply chain during COVID-19. Also, next Thursday on the 25th, Shannon Jackson will be presenting DoD's Office of Small Business Programs Cybersecurity Initiative Project Spectrum. So today we're featuring Mr. David Steeren from the National Institute of Standards and Technology Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program. That is a mouthful, David. Mr. Steeren is the Division Chief for Extension Services at NIST MEP. He oversees a division that works with MEP Centers, U.S. manufacturers, NIST laboratories, and other government agencies, as well as stakeholders, to develop and deploy approaches that are used by the national network of MEP centers to provide extension services to U.S. manufacturers. The NIST MEP Extension Services Division focus is the provision of the national level guidance and resources to MEP centers as they provide technical and business assistance to U.S. manufacturers to help them grow and compete in the global marketplace. So welcome, Mr. David Steeren, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Arvise. Thank you to everyone that is on today's webcast, and I appreciate everyone joining in. Folks, I have a good amount of information that I'm going to be presenting today that's going to introduce you to the MEP program, the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program. I'm going to talk to you about who we are, what we do, why we do it, how we do it. I'm also going to focus on how and where we interact with several components of the U.S. Department of Defense, including the Department of the Navy. And in addition, I'm going to give you some information about what our MEP program and our MEP National Network of Centers is currently doing in response to the national crisis, as that is something that is really at the forefront of all business programs today, whether they're public or private. One other thing that I'll mention before I get started. First, I want to thank Arvise and Adrian and Destiny and Ashley for the invitation and for the opportunity to give the webcast today. The DoD has always been one of the primary partners of the MEP program, and we have a lot going on with the Department of the Navy, so we appreciate the partnership and we look forward to doing good things going forward. In addition, I just want to let everyone know that we have a chat feature that's operational for the webcast. At any point during my presentation, please feel free to input chat, and some combination of our friends that will not be speaking are going to be monitoring the chat and will interrupt me, and I'm happy to answer questions as they come up. And I'll also do my very best at the end to conclude a little bit early so that folks can ask questions at the end. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into it. Next slide, please. So MEP, our program. The MEP program was created in 1988. And the purpose of the program was to really address a national market failure that was determined to exist in the 1980s, whereby small manufacturers did not have access to the resources that they need, be they technical or otherwise, to most effectively compete in the global marketplace. So MEP was actually created in 1988, and we celebrated our 30th year anniversary in 2018. So we're a 32-year-old program. And the same market failure that existed in the 1980s that created MEP still actually exists today. It's interesting, if you look at the manufacturing demographics in the United States, nearly 99% of all manufacturing establishments that operate in the US today are in fact considered small to medium-sized establishments. And that's a term that's defined by the US Small Business Administration as 500 or fewer employees at a single location. So MEP is a program that is based upon an extension model that specifically targets the provision of hands-on technical assistance to this dearth, this plethora of small US manufacturers by the operation of local technical assistance centers in every US state and Puerto Rico. So if you look on this slide, this is basically MEP in a slide. So our centers, they are all non-federal centers. The only federal aspect associated with the MEP program is NIST MEP. So I operate as a division chief at the Program Management Office for the MEP program, which is part of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a non-regulatory agency of the US Department of Commerce. All of our centers operate as non-federal entities. They're either nonprofit entities, they're embedded within universities, or they're parts of state government agencies. We have an MEP center in every US state and Puerto Rico. So again, it's an extension model. Go to the manufacturers where they are, provide them assistance in their factory. If you're manufacturing product in the United States, you're within a 2-hour drive of an MEP center. So it's a public-private partnership. It's got local flexibility. None of our centers are super centers. And when I say center, folks, I'm not talking about a center of excellence that's focused on doing R&D, or that's focused on being part of an institute. These are hands-on technical assistance centers that get out and interact with and provide assistance to manufacturers by the tens of thousands on an annual basis. If you look across the top of this slide, the business model, there's both federal funds as well as non-federal funding that goes into the program. In fiscal 20, the federal share that runs through NIST is $146 million out to our nationwide network of MEP centers. And then with the passage of the CARES Act in response to the current national emergency that was passed in March, an additional $50 million was added to the MEP center's budget to enable them to provide emergency services to the nation's manufacturers during this time of crisis. Typically, the federal dollars that go into this program must be cost shared through the provision of, through the collection of fees that are charged for services that are provided by our centers. But with the passage of the CARE Act, the cost share requirement from centers has been waived for the remainder of 2020. So again, our program, it's a market-driven program. It's intended to create high value for manufacturers. Our centers do what the market determines that manufacturers need. And I'm going to give you details about what all this means. Again, we have no super center. Our centers leverage partners to maximize their service offerings. So when an MEP center has a client that has a particular need that the center can't meet, they work with other centers across our nationwide network to be able to meet those needs. They work with third parties to be able to ensure that no manufacturer that has a need for a technical assistance from an MEP center gets turned away. Again, we're an extension-based program. Every state and Puerto Rico, we effectively operate as a nationwide public good consultancy where we have over 1,000 specialists that are operating in manufacturing factories, providing hands-on assistance to companies. And really our focus is transferring technology transitioning technology, making best practices and best processes available to companies as they need them, regardless of what the source of those practices and technologies and best practices are. Next slide. So here's what the nationwide network of MEP centers looks like. And here you really see the fact that we're there's a mosaic here. Our centers, some of our centers have the word MEP in their name, others do not. There's a lot of local brand recognition for MEP centers across the country. So we do not mandate that a center has the term MEP in its name, but every center brands itself as being part of the MEP national network, so that when a small manufacturer gets assistance from an MEP center, they know that they're part of a larger national program. Again, you heard me say our centers either operate as nonprofits, parts of universities, or embedded within state government agencies. About 2/3 of our centers are nonprofits. So if you look in the state of California, for example, you see CMTC, that's California Manufacturing Technology Consulting. They're headquartered in Torrance, California, but they have operations all over the state to ensure geographic coverage. Of the remaining 1/3 of the MEP centers, about half of them are within universities. So if you look down in Georgia, Georgia MEP is headquartered at Georgia Tech. But it's not in a research component of Georgia Tech. It's in the economic development / industrial extension side of Georgia Tech. And then if you look, for example, in Ohio, you see that the Ohio MEP is part of the Ohio Development Servicing Agency, which is an economic development aspect of the state government of Ohio. Next slide. So some numbers. If you look at our program, our national network, 50 centers plus Puerto Rico, so 51 overall centers. Out of those 51 overall centers, we have about 375 service locations. So we have one central MEP center in every state, and then each center basically has regional locations to ensure that great geographic coverage around the state. Operating across our national network, out of those 51 centers, we have over 1,400 manufacturing experts that are typically engineers, former plant managers, former company owners that are now working in MEP centers to provide that public good level of technical assistance that companies need. In addition, we partner with over 2,000 service providers and other entities that expand our ability to offer just about any kind of technical assistance service that any manufacturer anywhere might need as they seek assistance from an MEP center. Next slide.
David, before we move on, we have a question.
Sure.
Do you work with the local PTACs or tech bridges or deputies for small business programs? It sounds like MEP centers would be a good partner to leverage those outreach events.
Yeah, fantastic question and very astute observation. And the short answer to the question is yes. And in my coming slides where I talk about specifically the work that we do in partnership with both the US Navy and then the broader DoD, I will address both how we're working with tech bridges as well as the local PTACs. So let's talk about our partners. So our program on a nationwide basis, we work a lot with federal agencies and laboratories, whether they're DoD from DOE. We work with our own agency at NIST. We do a lot of work with the NIST laboratories related to measurements and standards. We work with other federal agencies that include the Small Business Administration, Economic Development Administration elsewhere within Commerce. So it's a very broad-reaching program in that regard. All of our centers are very, very tightly woven into the economic development fabric within the state. So state and local government are important partners. Many of our centers actually get cost-shared funding from state governments as part of the match that they're required to provide in return for the federal investment into our program. Additionally, all of our centers, economic development is really a big local motivator So we work with a significant number of economic development organizations at the local level, at the state level, at the regional level, at the federal level, and folks even at the international level. Additionally, you heard me talk about the fact that many of our centers are embedded in universities. Additionally, we do a lot of work with community colleges and technical schools. As you can imagine, a lot of the assistance that we provide to companies is in fact in the form of training. MEP centers don't always, intend that they have the lock on particular training. And in fact, very frequently we refer to companies to local community colleges and technical schools to get the type of training that meets their needs best. In addition, we work with industry leaders and supply chain organizations, trade associations, and other partners. Our program serves the U.S. manufacturing sector. So if you're a manufacturing and you have a NAICS code that starts with a 3.1, a 3.2, or a 3.3, you're in scope for MEP Center assistance. About 90% of the clients that we serve are those small businesses, but we do also work with larger companies because much of what we do is in part of supply chains. And in order for us to be most effective in terms of the services that we provide in supply chains, we very frequently work with tops of supply chains, including OEMs and prime contractors. Next slide, please. This is my one cheerleading slide, folks. I apologize, but I have to show you some of the impacts associated with our relatively small program. So recall that I said for fiscal 20, the base federal investment in the MEP program was $146 million. And then we got an additional $50 million through the CARES Act. Back in 2019, our base funding was $140 million. After our centers conduct projects with companies, we have a third-party organization. This is a non-federal organization that goes in and asks every company that we serve questions, a series of questions that measure the impacts of the services that our MEP centers provided to those companies. So in 2019, we served over 28,000 companies, and resulting from about 9,000 survey responses, we learned that the services that our centers provided, their impacts included the creation or retention of almost 115,000 jobs in the manufacturing companies that we serve. In addition, our services resulted in over $15.5 billion with a B, new and retained sales for those companies. The companies that we serve turned around and made investments in their own companies, totaling about $4.5 billion, again with a B. And the companies that we served, our services resulted in $1.5 billion in cost savings. So folks, I have to show you this cheerleading slide because for a relatively small federal investment, the economic impacts and returns on the investment from this program are enormous. Next slide. So how do we work with manufacturers? There is no cookie cutter approach. We'll basically work with any company that seeks to avail itself of our services. But if we had to break it down into bare principles, it looks something like this. So a center has an initial contact with a company, whether it's through a group session like a lunch and learn, or a workshop, a topical workshop, or some type of referral, perhaps an OEM referring suppliers to an MEP center or some other means. Once there's an initial contact, there will then be a desire, hey, we want to learn more about this, or hey, MEP Center, can you help us in this particular area? Our centers will then go and work with a company to conduct an assessment. They'll go actually into the company. A lot of times they'll do this online and then follow up in person, but they'll do an assessment. What are you doing? Where are you trying to get to? This is what we see as opportunities. This is where we see gaps. This is where we see problems. So that will be the identification. You know, what are the issues? What are the opportunities where you might improve? How might we address pain points? How might we help you achieve your goals? And our center will then basically work with a company to define and propose a project and an approach to completing that project. Our center and companies will then negotiate the terms, and then they'll come to agreement, and then our center will actually execute. When they execute a project, it'll typically involve center staff, partner organizations, and/or third-party consultants that a center may call in as a specialized technical expert. Very typically, it may also involve additional MEP centers as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, after the completion of the project, all projects are in fact followed up and surveyed by a third-party entity to measure the impacts. In the middle of this slide, you see the Net Promoter Score. Net Promoter Score is a very simple metric that's used to determine the extent to which an organization that receives services from an MEP center would in fact refer a friend or family member to that MEP center for receipt of services. Generally, anything over a 50 for a Net Promoter Score is considered good. The nationwide aggregate Net Promoter Score for MEP centers in 2019 was 85, which is very good on an aggregate national basis. Next slide. When we survey clients, we also always ask clients to identify their most pressing challenges. It helps us identify where we need to focus our attention in terms of ensuring that we have nationwide capabilities to address the provision of technical assistance in certain areas. So we always hear things like cost reduction. So, you know, while lean and quality are kind of blocking and tackling and where companies start, cost reduction never goes away. Small companies are always looking to reduce costs. Workforce and employee issues are always up at the top. So there you see the numbers there. It's this in 2019, it was the second most pressing client challenge. You know, we very frequently hear from CEOs that what keeps them up at night more than anything is whether they're going to have the workforce that they need to ensure continuity of operations. Many small manufacturers are looking to grow on an ongoing and recurring basis. There's a lot of latent capacity that's out there, and small manufacturers typically go to MEP centers to help them identify opportunities and approaches for growth. Product development. A lot of companies tend to be very innovative, and they're looking for help with how they can develop new means to perhaps enter new marketplaces or improve their current product lines, or increase their share of marketplaces. So that's a big facet of things that MEP centers do. And then inevitably, small manufacturers need help with being sustainable organizations. Sustainability in terms of continuity of business operations, as well as sustainability from you know, an environmental standpoint as well. Next slide. So when you look at the types of technical assistance that MEP centers provide to U.S. manufacturers, here's an example. This is not comprehensive, but it does give you an idea of the types of areas where MEP centers work with companies to provide them hands-on in-factory technical assistance. So down the bottom, you see ISO and quality, lean manufacturing and Toyota Kata up top. So again, folks, lean in, you know, if you're not operating an efficient quality organization, you're not going to be in business. That's one of the core competencies of the MEP program on a nationwide basis. Pretty much every MEP center can do and does provide lean services and ISO and quality services. I will mention in that vein, our centers do not operate as auditors in any capacity. They serve as trusted advisors to companies. We're not ISO registrars. We don't do any kind of regulation or anything along those lines. We serve to help companies understand what they need to do to comply with things, to get registered, to get certified, but we don't actually do those registrations and certifications. And when we're working with regulatory agencies, such as, for example, the DoD, we don't do any types of audits as part of our centers. We do a lot of work in cybersecurity. In fact, I'm going to give you some details about how we've been operating in the space of cybersecurity with the defense manufacturing supply chains. Along those lines, we do a great deal of work relating to supply chains and scouting for suppliers. A lot of companies are trying to find local domestic sources of supply. And through our nationwide network of MEP centers, we can very typically find companies that can make just about anything in the United States and get them into supply chains. We do a lot of work associated with technology scouting and tech-driven market intelligence. Interesting thing, this is an aspect associated with companies that need to find new technologies or need to incorporate new approaches, into their operations. And it's a technical assistance services that we offer across the country to help companies do this. Business growth services, product development is a big aspect of that. We help companies go through appropriate and efficient product development cycles, from product concept to getting resources that they need to actually going through the development, then to scale up and into production. Industry 4.0 and taking companies through the processes that they need to be able to implement the connection of cyber and physical systems, so that they can have a digital thread running from end to end within a factory and across supply chains. Exporting is a big thing that companies are interested in when they're looking to expand. And then simultaneously, we help companies reshore. Companies that have set supply operations overseas, we help them bring those companies back on shore. So again, this is not comprehensive, but this is just an example of many of the service areas there where our centers provide assistance to manufacturers. Next slide.
So before we go on to the next slide, you piqued a lot of interest with the cybersecurity. So in the DoD marketplace, we're moving to CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. How is it that your organization can help small businesses, or how are you adapting to CMMC?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, everything that I've given you heretofore has been intro to MEP, talking about how we operate and what we do. In a couple of slides, I'm going to give you some details about specifically what our MEP centers and program are doing to provide small manufacturers, small defense contractors, the assistance that they need currently to help them to be able to comply with the requirements of the DFARS for cybersecurity protections, as well as to position them to be able to put in place the protections that they need for the appropriate CMMC level of maturity that's going to apply to the contracts that they either have or are bidding for. So I'll give you details about that in a couple of slides. So with that, let's go ahead and move on. So what I'm now going to do is transition and give you a handful of slides about work that we're currently doing specifically with the Navy, and then in a broader sense with the DoD, including activities with the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And then I'll talk about some other DoD areas. And as part of that, I'm certainly going to highlight cybersecurity. So let's start with the U.S. Navy, since this is the Office of Navy Small Business Programs. Two things I want to highlight. Over the course of the last year or so, our MEP centers have begun to become very active with Navy tech bridges through the Naval X initiative. And currently, we are in the process of negotiating a partnership on a national level between NIST MEP on behalf of the MEP National Network and the Office of Naval Research and the Assistant Secretary of Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition that will leverage the MEP centers to incorporate and engage small manufacturers into the activities of tech bridges that are operating around the U.S. And currently, the states where we're targeting for these activities include Rhode Island, South Carolina, Florida, Indiana, California, and Washington. And the partnership that we're putting in place is being structured such that we hope to be able to expand this to apply to any tech bridge that comes online around the country. Again, the emphasis there is MEP centers work with the local small manufacturers that operate near the tech bridges, and we will facilitate the connection of tech bridge activities and resources to small manufacturers and engage those small manufacturers in the operations of the tech bridges. It's a very, very promising partnership, and we've seen some very good early returns, primarily out of the states of Rhode Island and Washington. We're getting South Carolina, Florida, Indiana, and California online during 2020. In addition, I also want to highlight a technology insertion activity that involves an interagency agreement between NIST MEP and Naval Sea Systems Command that is specifically focused on technology insertion for the Ford-class aircraft carrier production that's occurring down in Newport News. And the way that we're doing this, again, we're structuring this in such a way that we're capturing all of the modernization and advanced technology integration that's occurring here, so that we can replicate this activity to other shipyards and other shipbuilding programs around the country as those opportunities come into play. Most notably, it appears that in the near term, these applications may apply to both Virginia and Columbia-class submarine production. But right now, actively, we're looking at steel fabrication and assembly lines in Newport News for Ford-class aircraft carrier production. Next slide.
Before we move on, sir, we have a question?
Sure.
Is there a program for startups to be paired with small manufacturers to trial new and innovative technologies?
Through the MEP, we don't have anything currently at the national level. However, we are looking to connect as many small companies with our MEP centers and partners as possible. So if you were to approach an MEP center or NIST MEP about doing that, we would look at the specific need, the specific requirement, and we have programmatic means by which we can make connections. I just don't have a national program that's nicely wrapped in a bow that I can talk to you about. But we would work with, for example, SBIR, and across multiple agencies, whether it was DoD or NIH or DOE or NIST. We would look at other funding opportunities, whether they were through SBA or through the Economic Development Administration. Basically, we would work as a trusted advisor to help make whatever connection a company might need. Okay, let me continue. Let me highlight, because there was a question about this as well, cybersecurity, what our national network is doing in the space of cybersecurity specific to the DoD. Folks, back in 2017, the Trump administration issued an executive order, EO 13806, that put in place an analysis of the resiliency of the defense industrial base. And as part of that executive order, there was a whole of government response that was led by the DoD, but it involved just about every federal agency that related to manufacturing. And the way that analysis was done is it was broken up into, I think it was 18 different sectors, 14 that were very specific to product lines of the DoD, and then I think it was 4 that were cross-cutting. One of the cross-cutting areas was, in fact, cybersecurity for manufacturing. I had the good fortune of being able to chair the interagency group that addressed the cybersecurity manufacturing aspect of that. And as a result of that, we also remain active, and I represent NIST MEP in our program in the efforts of the joint DoD Joint Industrial Base Working Group. Largely as a result of this, as well as ongoing activities that we've had working in partnership with the DoD, we've had other activities pop up as a result. So next slide. So back in 2019, NIST MEP and the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering executed an interagency agreement to help the DoD basically address a lot of the shortcomings that were being realized in terms of small defense contractors not being compliant with the requirements of DFARS. So as you all know, DFARS 252.2004-7 or 204-7012 calls for certain cybersecurity requirements to be in place in any DoD acquisition contract. The requirements, the compliance with that DFARS clause have been low. So as a result, we engaged in a partnership at the national level to bring our MEP centers in on a coordinated basis to help address this issue. So working with over 30 MEP centers in over 30 states, led by our MEP Center in Michigan, we're now working with the Office of the Secretary of Defense on a funded basis to provide nationwide cybersecurity awareness, hands-on technical assistance, and pilot of operational technology protections for over 1,000 small defense contractor organizations. This is an activity that's been operating since 2019 and will continue through the end of 2020. On this slide, you see the over 30 states that are involved in this activity, and you see that we're also collaborating with the NIST laboratories as well as the MXD Manufacturing USA Institute in Chicago. And then additionally, we're also working a lot with PTACs, and I'm going to tell you more about PTAC operations in just a second, as well as how this is kind of working into the CMMC program. Next slide. So, talking about cybersecurity, let me give you a snapshot of what we're doing and some of the resources that we have available and some of the things that we've been conducting. So the Office of Economic Adjustment out of the Office of the Secretary of Defense is making a significant amount of funding available to state government entities, state-based entities, to address workforce issues associated with cybersecurity. In fiscal 2020 alone, a dozen MEP centers have received approximately $15 million from the OEA to be part of these grants to state-based agencies to address cybersecurity workforce and training, education and training issues for defense contractors. Over on the right, our centers have conducted over the last couple of years about 225 awareness and training events nationwide, including many of these events that have been conducted jointly with PTACs. NIST MEP executed a memorandum of understanding with the Association of PTACs on a national scale in 2017, and the focus of our joint collaboration is in fact cybersecurity, and the intent is that MEP centers and local PTACs work together to ensure that manufacturers that are operating in defense supply chains have both the awareness that they need in terms of what is required of them with respect to cybersecurity protections that are part of DoD contracts, and then that they can also receive the assistance that they need to ensure that they have the protections in place. So our centers work with PTACs across the country, doing events, creating awareness, sharing clients, and making sure that clients have the services that they need. Additionally, I just want to highlight that my cybersecurity services manager, Pat Toth, in 2017 published a handbook, NIST Handbook 162, that helps companies do self-assessments to determine whether they have the protections that they need to be able to comply with DFARS. Since its publication in November of 2017, that handbook has been downloaded about 78,000 times, and our entire MEP national network has been trained on its use. And then lastly, down the bottom, I want to highlight that there's a NIST interagency report, 7621, Small Business Information Security, the Fundamentals. This is kind of like the gospel for from coming out of the NIST laboratories for small businesses and how they should approach cybersecurity. Since it was published in late 2016, it's been downloaded from the NIST website about 165,000 times. Next slide.
So David, there's a lot of interest in cybersecurity, and you got some great information here. How can a small business become involved in this?
Sure. So the best way to start is go to the NIST MEP website, www.nist.gov/MEP. And on my last slide, I'll have that contact info on that slide. Right on our main homepage, you'll see cybersecurity resources available for manufacturers. Click on that and you can access basically everything that we have in terms of assessments that companies can take, and we have small assessments. You can access the NIST cybersecurity framework, the identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, and the tips that we provide on terms of how you can implement those 5 core elements of the cybersecurity framework. We have information about what to do if you're a defense contractor and you need to learn how to become compliant with DFARS. And then we're also starting to point to CMMC. In addition, before I get into the CMMC details, on that NIST MEP website, there's an area that says the MEP National Network. If you click on that, how to connect, you'll find a tab that says how to connect with your local MEP center. You can access your local MEP center in every state and Puerto Rico from that tab. So I would start with the NIST MEP website, and if you need specific MEP center assistance, click on the access to your local MEP center. So now let me tell you about what we're doing with CMMC in the space of cyber. So as you all know, CMMC is the new cybersecurity maturity model certification program that the DoD is rolling out through the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. We're starting to see some pilot programs that are going to be coming into place in 2020, and it's anticipated that full implementation of this will occur in about 5 years. So what is CMMC? How's it different than DFARS? So DFARS was a self-attestation. CMMC is basically going to be a third-party certification process that's going to occur up front. So before a company bids on a contract, they're going to need to have the appropriate certification level associated with that contract, whether it's level 1 for just very basic cyber hygiene, all the way up to a level 4 and 5, which are much more proactive and oriented toward the tightest controls. If you look at the current DFARS requirements, the call for adequate security to be put in place through the implementation of NIST Special Publication 800-171, that's going to come in at about a level 3 with CMMC. So just as our centers have been working with companies to help them understand how to be compliant with DFARS, our centers will continue to work with companies to help them understand what they need to do to have a level 3 certification or a level 4 certification or whatever level certification they need for a particular government DoD contract on which they may be bidding. Again, I want to stress our centers will not be certifying bodies. They will not be auditors. They will be hands-on trusted advisors that companies will use that will help companies understand the requirements and implement the requirements so that they can in fact get that third-party certification. One thing I'll mention, CMMC, even when it comes on, it's not going to negate DFARS requirements. They're still going to be in place. It's just going to be a matter of where the CMMC level requirements fall. Next slide. Also want to highlight that our centers work a lot with the Manufacturing USA Institutes. These are the institutes that started coming online as a result of the Revitalizing American Manufacturing Innovation Act of 2014. 15 institutes are currently operational. 8 of them are sponsored by the DoD, 6 by the DOE, and 1 by NIST. NIST actually handles the cross interagency whole of government coordination of these institutes, and the MEP National Network is very involved in partnerships with these institutes to the extent that we've had MEP center staff embedded at the institutes to basically help connect small manufacturers with the advanced manufacturing technologies and markets that are the focus of the institutes. We've been doing this since 2016, And in 2019, we published a report that highlights some of the learnings in terms of how manufacturers engage with these advanced technologies, with these markets, and also with the institutes. There you see some of the summaries. Over on the right, you see the listing of the 14 institutes. The one that's not here is the recent DOE Cybersecurity Institute. And on the left here, you see the MEP Center that's leading the embedding activity in each one of the institutes. Next slide, please. So in addition to what I just communicated, I also want to let you know that, and I mentioned this earlier, we have an active MOU on behalf of the national network with APTAC. And the purpose here is to really help facilitate coordination, collaboration, and partnerships between our MEP centers and local PTACs to ensure that defense contractors get both the business assistance that they need through PTACs, as well as the hands-on technical assistance that they need through MEP centers. In addition, we do a lot of work with SBIR. Since the beginning of 2017, we've had over 80 projects that we've worked with SBIR companies through our MEP centers in a lot of different areas, helping them with proposal writing, helping them with commercialization assistance as part of phase 2, helping them go from phase 2 to phase 3. So we know and work with SBIR pretty well across the country. In addition, we deal with and work with a lot of other technology transfer and transition projects that are conducted by different partnership intermediary activities, such as, for example, Miltech, that help rapidly transition new technology and other practices to the warfighter. And the way that we do that is these PIAs leverage our nationwide network of MEP centers to engage companies as part of these technology transition activities to help facilitate the rapid transition of the technologies. Next slide. So real quickly, and I'm going to go through this in about 5 minutes, I want to also highlight that our centers have been very active in terms of helping manufacturers respond to the national emergency. So really there's been 4 primary areas where our centers have been focused, but they're all really helping U.S. manufacturers respond to the urgent need that our country has for personal protective equipment, medical equipment, and supplies. In addition, though, we're not just responding to the current need, we're also working with companies to help ensure that companies stay alive, stay in business, and are prepared for recovery. So the 4 areas where we have been focused since the national crisis hit has been helping manufacturers connect resources to needs, working directly with state governments, as I said earlier, addressing specific issues relating to PPE, medical supplies, and medical devices, and then helping manufacturers maintain base operations and helping ensure that our MEP centers don't just serve those manufacturers that are in fact doing something in response to the crisis, but also helping ensure that our economy stays operational to the fullest extent as is possible. Next slide. So folks, I have 1 slide on each one of those 4 areas, and I'm just going to go through these very quickly so that we leave time at the end for questions and answers. So again, connecting resources to needs. Our centers are really well positioned and have found themselves really operating kind of in a go-to sense in a state and local basis to connect industry organizations, federal agencies, state and local government agencies, and manufacturers to help share critical information, connect resources, and address urgent needs that have included things like supply chain mapping, looking at food supply chains, medical supply chains, helping ensure that supply chain portals operate, and a whole bunch of other different areas. Down the bottom, you see some of the other federal agencies that we've been working with as we've been operating in this space, to include the DoD, to include FEMA, FDA, and the SBA. One of the things that our centers have been doing is ensure that manufacturers understand how they can access the SBA PPP efforts so that they can, in fact, ensure that they continue to make payroll. Next slide, please. Centers have been really put in a very strong position within a lot of states to basically serve as kind of that go-to point within state governments, working directly with state legislatures and governors to basically ensure that as policies are being put in place within states, that the local manufacturing base is connected into those policies, and so that the policies and the needs and the capabilities of the local manufacturers coincide as best as possible. Next slide. Thirdly, supplier scouting. This is an area where there's been a big need. Hey, MEP Centers, MEP program. We need a particular component for a ventilator that is being produced. We're taking an automobile production plant and we're pivoting its capabilities to produce ventilators, but we can't find a company that produces this particular component. So at the national level, we have all of our MEP centers participating in a rigorous effort that allows us to go out and do a national analysis of capabilities and capacities to meet supply chain needs and be able to conduct that analysis within 1 week. Next slide. So this is just more details about this. Again, we do this within a week. We don't just do it in response to the current emergency, but that's really been the trigger for the efforts that we've been conducting over the past several weeks. Next slide. So for PPE suppliers and medical devices, we're helping companies pivot. A lot of companies have been making products and their markets have been shrinking. So they're taking their capabilities and capacities and they're moving them into this space. Our centers work with them to help identify the market, to help get them in touch with actual procurements, and certainly to give them the technical guidance as they go through that retooling process within their factories. Here you see examples of all the different PPE medical supplies and medical devices just that we've been able to work with since about the beginning of March. Next slide. And then lastly, I just want to mention that our centers, we don't just work with companies right now that are responding to the national crisis. Our mission remains work with all manufacturers. So, we continue to fulfill our MEP program of strengthening and empower U.S. manufacturers. And the purpose is to maintain the health of U.S. manufacturing base as it faces this extraordinary emergency. And we're trying to position companies not just to stay alive, but get into that recovery mode, which we feel and hope is going to happen very quickly. Down in the check mark bullets, you see the different areas where we're doing that. Next slide. So folks, with that, in wrap up, I just want to say we have a decades-long history of working with many DoD components and programs. We got a specific emphasis of providing hands-on technical assistance to small defense manufacturers that really constitute the bulk of the defense industrial base. And I just want your main takeaway, we're a viable partner. We seek to partner with as many organizations as possible. And through our program and through our nationwide network, you can connect with manufacturer needs within the U.S. one at a time, but on a national scale, literally each year by the tens of thousands, basically in response to, as well as in preparation for, recovery from this national emergency. Here's my contact info. I think down at the bottom is our website. Did I include that on there? Gosh, I hope I did. If I didn't, it's on the title slide. And with that, Arvis, that's all I have to say. And I'm happy to address any questions that we may have gotten in.
Great. Thank you so much, sir. That was a wealth of information. So we don't have any questions currently, but one of the questions would be, as a small business where they might be challenged financially to bring in resources, to look at agreements and things, what are the costs to that? And is there some assistance with that?
Sure. So depending upon, the nature of what we do, if we have a company, for example, that is looking to enter the defense supply chain that doesn't currently operate in that space, and they wanted some assistance in terms of the business side of that, very typically, RVs, we would put them in touch with a PTAC. And we would say, hey, PTAC, can you help this company out? They're a client of ours, MEP Center. Our focus is on kind of the technical assistance that they need. Or if there's not a federal entity like that, our centers, because they're so well aligned with and in tune with and an integral part of the fabric of the state ecosystem in which they operate, very typically they'll be aware of state-based programs that can provide them those types of business resources. And we also work with the SBA through the SBTDCs that provide and SBDCs that provide those types of resources. And then also we turn companies on very frequently to resources of the Economic Development Administration. So great question. And know that MEP, we're not a granting program like that. We don't provide loans. We don't provide those types of resources to companies. But as that kind of public good consultant, it's our job to make sure that companies do have access and awareness of all the resources that are at their disposal that we can help them connect into.
Great. Well, thank you. I don't see any other questions either in our chat or in the Q&A section. So would just like to, on behalf of Mr. Jimmy Smith, the Director of the Navy Small Business Programs Office, and myself and the team, thank you for your time today. Appreciate all that you shared with us. We're going to be pushing your information out. So hopefully you'll be getting some new clients that will be looking for some assistance. So thank you so much, Mr. Steering. And
thank you very much for the opportunity, Arvis. That was a great opportunity. We welcome partnerships with any of the DoD components, and the defense industrial base is absolutely a priority for us. And anything that we can do to help improve national security is part of our program. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, take care, sir, and you have a wonderful evening and an even better week.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for
Thanks
everyone.
all for attending.